In 2008, while an entire nation watched its currency collapse to dust, while grown men wept outside banks, while shopkeepers refused to sell bread for paper money, one quiet, unremarkable clerk sat in his small rented room, holding nothing but a stack of green dollar bills and smiled. Nobody knew his name, nobody knew his secret, but by the time the dust settled, he wasn't just surviving the collapse, he was the richest man in his entire town. This is the true shape of that story. The man who bet against his own country. Karachi, 2008. The air smelled of diesel, dust, and desperation. Newspapers screamed headlines about inflation, about the rupee falling against the dollar every single day, about a government that seemed powerless to stop the bleeding. In the narrow streets of Sadar, shopkeepers argued with customers over prices that had doubled in a week. Old women clutched their life savings, wondering if the money in their hands would still buy rice by nightfall. In the middle of all this chaos lived a man named Aslam Sheikh, 34 years old, a low-level accounts clerk at a textile trading company, the kind of man nobody looked at twice. He wore the same 3 shirts on rotation, took the same crowded bus to work every morning, and lived in a single rented room above a tailor's shop. His salary was modest. His ambitions, everyone assumed, were even smaller. But Aslam noticed things. For years he had watched the ledgers at his company, invoices for imported cotton machinery, payments made in dollars, exchange rate columns that kept shifting more and more violently each quarter. While his colleagues complained about the rising cost of vegetables, Aslam was quietly doing something else. He was studying patterns. He borrowed old newspapers from the tea stall owner. He listened to the radio business bulletins that everyone else ignored. He started keeping a small notebook, not of expenses but of numbers, exchange rates, import bills, government borrowing figures, oil prices. His wife, Nasreen, used to tease him. "You read business news like it's a love letter," she'd say, watching him hunch over the newspaper by lamplight after dinner. He'd just smile and say nothing. By early 2007, Aslam had made a decision that seemed, to anyone who knew him, almost insane. He began converting every spare rupee he had, his savings, a small inheritance from his father, even money he quietly borrowed at low interest from a cooperative fund at work, into US dollars. Not through some clever investment scheme, not through stocks or property, just dollars kept safely, patiently, in a small metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his rented room. People around him thought he'd lost his mind. "Dollars don't grow, Aslam, buy," his neighbor Rashid laughed one evening, sipping tea outside the tailor's shop. "Put your money in property, buy gold, dollars just sit there doing nothing." Aslam only shrugged. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "doing nothing is exactly the plan." What Aslam understood, what almost nobody around him wanted to accept, was that the rupee wasn't just having a bad year. Pakistan's foreign reserves were shrinking, oil import bills were climbing, political instability was scaring away foreign investment. Every signal he had studied in his little notebook pointed toward one uncomfortable truth: the currency was going to fall, and it was going to fall hard. He wasn't wrong. Through 2008, everything he feared began to unfold, exactly as the numbers had warned. The rupee, which had traded near 60 to the dollar just a couple of years earlier, began sliding uncontrollably. 60 became 70. 70 crossed 75. By the end of that brutal year, it had blown past 80, then edged toward 90, a collapse so steep that it wiped out the value of ordinary people's life savings almost overnight. The city changed in front of Aslam's eyes. Petrol prices tripled. Flour, sugar, and cooking oil became luxuries fought over in ration lines. Small business owners who had borrowed money in dollar-denominated loans found themselves suddenly owing far more than they had ever agreed to. Rashid, the same neighbor who had mocked Aslam's foolish dollar hoarding, lost almost his entire life savings when the small textile export business he had invested in collapsed under the weight of currency losses. "How did you know?" Rashid asked one night, his voice hollow, standing outside the same tea stall where he'd laughed months earlier. "How did you know this was coming?" Aslam didn't gloat. He never once raised his voice or bragged about being right. He simply said, "I wasn't smarter than anyone, I was just paying attention when everyone else stopped." While the rupee kept falling and panic spread through Karachi's markets, Aslam's small hoard of dollars was quietly becoming worth far more in local currency terms than it had ever been. The metal box under his floorboard, once holding what felt like a modest, almost embarrassing sum of savings, now represented a fortune by the standards of his neighborhood. He hadn't gambled on stocks. He hadn't taken wild risks. He had simply protected his money from a storm he saw coming, and let the storm do the rest of the work for him. But here is the part of Aslam's story that people often get wrong when they retell it. He didn't simply sit back and get rich by accident. The real turning point came in the way he used what he had. As 1,000 rupee notes became worth less and less, and dollar holders like Aslam found themselves suddenly cash-rich in relative terms, opportunities began appearing everywhere for those who had liquidity when everyone else didn't. Desperate shop owners were selling inventory at huge discounts just to get any cash in hand. Property owners, terrified of losing everything, were offloading small plots of land far below their real value, just to convert uncertain assets into whatever stable money they could find. Import businesses that couldn't pay their dollar-denominated supplier bills were looking for partners who could bring in foreign currency quickly. Aslam began converting a portion of his dollars back into rupees, not blindly but strategically, at the moments of greatest opportunity. He bought a small plot of commercial land in an area of Karachi that panicked owners were selling far under value, convinced it would keep depreciating along with everything else. He partnered quietly with a small hardware trading business that desperately needed dollar liquidity to pay an overdue import shipment, taking a modest ownership stake in exchange for the currency they needed. He helped a friend's failing garment export unit survive by advancing dollars against future export orders, earning a fair return once those orders were fulfilled. None of this happened overnight. It happened patiently over nearly 2 years, one careful decision at a time. By 2010, as the rupee's freefall finally began to stabilize into something closer to predictable movement, Aslam Sheikh was no longer the anonymous accounts clerk from the room above the tailor's shop. He owned a share in 2 small businesses. He owned land that had tripled in value once the panic selling ended and the market recovered. And he still held a portion of his original dollars, now worth significantly more in rupee terms than when he had first converted his savings. His old company noticed the change too. The same accounts clerk who once quietly filed invoices was now being consulted, almost sheepishly, by senior managers who wanted to understand how he had seen it coming. Aslam never turned that knowledge into arrogance. When people asked him for advice, he gave it plainly, the same way he always had. "I didn't beat the market," he told a young cousin who once asked him the secret to his success. "I just refused to pretend that bad news wasn't bad news. Everyone could see the same numbers I saw, most people just didn't want to believe them." There's an important, often overlooked truth buried inside Aslam's story, one that separates it from a simple tale of luck. He wasn't rewarded merely for holding dollars. He was rewarded for a mindset, the discipline to study patterns instead of following crowd emotion, the patience to protect value quietly for 2 full years without needing validation from people who mocked him, and the courage to act decisively, not recklessly, when the moment of maximum fear arrived for everyone else. Rashid, the neighbor who had lost his savings, eventually came to Aslam not with jealousy but with humility. "Teach me," he said simply. Aslam did. Over the following years, he helped several people in his own small circle rebuild what they had lost, not by handing out money, but by teaching them the same principles that had protected him. Understand what your money is actually worth, watch the signs the country itself is giving you, and never assume that the way things have always been is the way things will always stay. By the time the rupee crisis of that era became a chapter in economic history books and business school case studies, Aslam Sheikh had quietly transformed his life. The man who once rode a crowded bus to a clerk's desk now owned commercial property, held stakes in 2 small but profitable businesses, and had built something far more valuable than his original savings, a reputation as someone whose calm, careful judgment could be trusted when everyone else was panicking. He never moved into a mansion. He never flaunted expensive cars or extravagant clothes. Those who met him years later, sitting in a modest but comfortable office overseeing his small business investments, still found him wearing simple clothes, still found him drinking the same plain tea from the same stall where Rashid once mocked his foolish habit. When asked much later whether he felt guilty profiting while others suffered during the currency crisis, Aslam gave an answer that revealed the quiet philosophy behind everything he had done. "I didn't cause the crisis," he said. "I didn't wish for it. I simply refused to be destroyed by something I could see coming from far away, and once I was safe, I used what I had to help pull others up with me instead of stepping over them." That, in the end, is the real lesson buried inside the story of the man who grew wealthy while his country's currency was sinking. It was never really about dollars. It was about paying attention when everyone else looked away, about patience when everyone else panicked, and about using whatever advantage you're given not just to enrich yourself but to lift others once the storm has passed. The rupee eventually stabilized. New crises would come in the years that followed, as they always do in any nation's economic history. But Aslam Sheikh, the quiet clerk who once hid dollar bills beneath a floorboard while his neighbors laughed at him, had already learned the one lesson that mattered most. In the middle of collapse, clarity is the rarest currency of all, and those who hold on to it rarely stay poor for long.